All right, we're live. All right, thank you everybody for watching. We're here talking about Christianity, what makes it interesting without faith. So maybe I'll start. I know, I grew up evangelical, right? Where this is literally true. This is how it is. So it's interesting to know because I thought of the Bible as just like descending from heaven one day in the King James version, right? And then you learn how it actually got put together and like all the different viewpoints. And it's almost like I think of it as a murder mystery, like a true crime. How did it happen, right? And all the crazy theories on
Yeah, and for Christianity itself as a religion, um, like a lot of us, who came out of some sort of, church or whatever group, maybe we were born into it or we became Christians somehow. You like to think that Jesus came. He was living in Israel in the first century, and his teachings, and then Christianity, and then Orthodox, and then that's it. There's a pure straight line from Jesus to the church, and that's it. There's no one veered off at all. But when you start to actually look into the history, it's so much more interesting, first of all, but it's a lot more complex than just Jesus said some things, then church. A lot more. There's a lot more going on there. That's what I like to talk about. I like to get into the different branches of Christianities that became heretics later on. Marcion, those guys, the Carpocratians, the Nacenes. I love digging into those guys, and especially. And I think second century was really, that would have been a great time to be a Christian, I think.
it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and just like the lost traditions too, just the period where there's no surviving writings and just what was really going on
Right.
there. So here, maybe we'll let's see. So we have Dr. Gus Lott here, PhD in the hard sciences and Masters of Divinity, and then we have Lord Sobek. So if you watch, Gnostic Informant or MythVision, you'll know him. He's always commenting, also on my shows. So here he is. He started his own channel.
Yeah, I'm that crazy guy in the background, just
Yeah.
spewing nonsense.
And everybody knows Neal and Derek.
Everyone, I don't know about that, but
Yeah.
Thanks, man.
I mean, you guys are the cornerstones. Honestly, I think without Derek and Neal, let's just say without Derek,
exactly.
there is none of this. Like Derek laid the groundwork for all of this.
Yeah, Derek.
Without Neal, I'd still be going, should I even do this? Is it even worth it?
I appreciate it.
Well, what Derek is to me, what I'm trying to be for you now, Sobek, because
Yes.
when I started off, Derek was at 30,000 subscribers, and he showed me some things and taught me some things, and I paid attention, and my channel grew. And now you're starting your channel, and I'm at 30,000. Hopefully, I could do the same for you, and you too, Elliot. If I do have, we can get into that's a whole nother topic. But anyways, I just wanted to throw that out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that was exactly.
I might say something, Elliot, about this that I think is important with the topic. And I haven't met Dr. Lott here, so this is my first time actually meeting you. But it is this question for why MythVision exists, because MythVision really is paying the vision on mythology or the mythography or the legend and as a fundamentalist Christian evangelical who was really obsessed doomsday, second coming of Jesus, theologically shifting within Christendom and trying to get to the most accurate truth of the truth, because my presupposition was this really is true. The Bible is true. And so I just have to figure out which one makes the most sense of the truth, which is the Bible. Then that bubble popped where it was like, oh, hold on. You mean there's a whole nother world of things that I'm like coming across through guys like Robert and Price or through, these obscure scholars that I've never heard of who are blowing my mind. And I'm like, there's not enough channels on this thing we call YouTube to listen. I've exhausted the resource. Maybe I should start one. And that's when I started MythVision. And then it was like, oh my gosh, I started off as fringe as you probably could get, Acharya S, astrotheology, zeitgeist. Every single myth was a Xerox copy. But that, I even said in an interview yesterday, that was even more beneficial. It made better sense, even though it wasn't right, than the idea that this guy really literally rose from the dead and literally walked on water and it was like, I'd rather take the false zeitgeist approach before I would think this literally is true. And then the rabbit trail just goes. And everybody's watching it. It's happening as we speak. So anyway.
Yeah. I kind of think the whole mythicism thing is often a response to you just recently deconverted. And now you're just like, none of it is true, right? And you kind of have to come to terms with a lot of this stuff is legit, right? But just like what actually happened historically.
Yeah, that's a good point, because when I'll just speak about myself, for example, leaving the church and then asking the question, like, what do we really know about this guy, Jesus? Like, what do we have? Did he write anything down? No. Is there somebody, does he have a brother that wrote something down? No. Is there somebody is there a group that he was a part of? Did he join any specific, like, is there anything that we can like physically touch that he was involved in? And the answer, then it's like, no. And then you're like, oh. So I think for a lot of people, when they are met with that, their reaction is, he didn't exist at all. He can't, how could he even existed at all? And so you go from one extreme to the other. And so I think a lot of people get stuck in that, and then they like sort of make that their new, like they sort of like build their thinking around that idea, and that's when they become the mythicist types of people. And I think it's a mistake, because I try to look at this without any biases, which is really hard to do. Like, we all have our biases, but when I let go of I try to look at all biases, like what could be true, what's the most likely scenario, and then I start, and obviously I'm not the expert, so I go to experts and read their books and interview them and hear what they say, and then weigh them out. And one scholar might say this, and one scholar might say that, and then I'll just come to my own opinions. And when I read the scholars and listen to people like Bart Ehrman or Francesco Stavropulo, they make sense. They know what they're talking about. When you read their books and listen to what they have to say, that makes a lot of sense. And there's enough out there that we can form our own opinions based on what the experts are actually saying. So that's my gist on that,
Yeah. So you think of it as somebody kind of walks away from a fundamentalist viewpoint. They're still almost fundamentalist a lot of times, but in the opposite direction, right? Wanting to disprove everything. And then when you look at it, try to see it without a bias. That's when you can have the most fun with it, right? Because you don't have a position in the fight, right? And it's almost like, if you could imagine looking at Mithraism, and you're like, no, Mithras is Perseus. He actually existed, and he sprang from a rock. That's it. End of story. Like, and how are you going to come to understand Mithraism, or like, if you're just implanted in that belief?
Yeah. And that's the thing about when you build your belief system, even if it's not like a belief, like religious belief, if it's just like your belief in what happened in the past, like mythicism, for example, that's just one example, but there's other beliefs, like people believe astrotheology is the entire Bible, so just pure astrotheology. Yeah. But when you make that your like cornerstone, like your centerpiece, and you build off that, then it's almost like you're now, here's what happens. You're looking for the evidence rather than reading the text and looking at the evidence. You're looking for certain things that promote what you want to be true. Does that make sense?
And Neal, just to go into what you're saying here, I think it's important. Now we have a hard scientist here who's aware of this methodology.
Yeah,
there's something important about how we're going to. How do we try to ascertain what happened? And
yeah, because I was guilty of this, where I would try to look up. I would look through the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And I'm looking for anything that looks close to Christianity that I can be like, look, they borrowed from this. Or I might pull up, I don't know, the Iliad or something. And now I'm looking through the Iliad. Anything that I can find that looks like Christianity and say, nope, there's one. Okay, they must have took it. And instead of actually like looking at things from a good methodology standpoint, I'm actually looking for the puzzle pieces, and I'm drawing my own lines to make the puzzle pieces fit. I'm drawing my own puzzle, and then I'm just making everything fit the way I want it to fit. That's very easy to do. You can make elaborate theories in any way you want. It's very easy to do. You see people do it all the time. In fact, Dr. Lott, what is your suggestion on how to avoid that?
Yeah, no, it's hard. I fell in love with Joseph Campbell's work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. When I at first, was kind of, I'd always been exposed to the Star Wars stuff and this kind of connection to his work. But I think it's fascinating how he just didn't make it in the academy at all, really. And I think it's because he was trying to do what you're talking about, which is this comparative thing, right? This comparing across myths. And it's something that I think you just can't find today, because I think academics are almost too scared. They just have to be their specific silo, and there's simply no room for them to be like an expert to compare like Christian symbols and I don't know, Hindu or Buddhist symbols, and see and then make theories about common archetypes. Like that's just so incredibly like high level that there's essentially nobody doing this kind of work in the academy. You have people like Bart Ehrman, who's like very accurate, very specifically interested in some specific Greek manuscript collection and involved in it. He's actually quite broad. Like I think he's an outlier, right? So you get these guys that write entire books on like one verse in the Gospel of John or something like that. And the academy is mostly this kind of really narrow, and they're almost like prevented from looking outside at other connections. And I think that's something that I kind of am sad about. I really enjoyed the way that Joseph Campbell, just went and like learned these languages, studied the myths, found underlying connections, whether they're some kind of Rorschach blot that he was seeing patterns in or not, is, I don't think that's true. I think there's gotta be this kind of like monomyth behind things. Just because there's a human experience that we all share, and essentially we're the same biologically across the entire planet. We're going to have the same kind of issues like birth, death, reproduction, eating, dealing with our neighbors, these kind of things, forming relationships. These are going to be things that he generalizes into functions of mythology. I think this is a valid hypothesis, but I was just so surprised getting into it, how it's kind of frowned upon to do this kind of like connection work in the academy. It's really kind of sad. It's something that I don't,
There are scholars who do this. They're more careful about their methodology. Litwa, as we talk about, M. David Litwa, Dennis MacDonald has a particular methodology mimetically, and there's others too. Like right now, I'm reading Richard C. Miller's book, which is, he pretty much just goes into like the resurrection and early Christianity and its reception, and he's pretty much saying that the earliest Christians did not literally believe Jesus rose in the literal apologetic sense that we think today. But just like the sons of Zeus and all of these things, as Justin Martyr is saying, he makes this really good case in here that I'm like, oh, wow. But what they want to do is they'll either look for a genetic connection, or they'll look for a cultural diffusion of some sense in which It's found within the culture. It's in the air. Everybody's seeing it. It's at street corners and stuff. The Mediterranean's loaded with the Iliad and the Odyssey, or maybe the Aeneid, and the imperial cult is putting this out there. And so there's like a competition, a political, social competition with Christianity. The other thing is like, I do think that there's some connections, ubiquitous connections. Like you say, the human experience, we all live, birth, die, feel suffering. We know what it's like to be tired. We know what it's like to have energy. And like we all, like Native Americans had their own mythos while we're over here on this side of the world and they're over here. And they had some particular mythology in which they lived by that didn't require a genealogical connection for them to have some meaning to an afterlife. They ancestral worship, animism, things like that. That I think it's interesting what you're saying. I think the reason many scholars are cautious on trying to make broad stroke, like everything is connected somehow in those mythologies, is they don't want to just do parallelomania, even if there is a ubiquitous connection, because we all experience things. They're not trying to say this one influenced that one or something. I think that's why they're trying to be cautious of it. Because I got a guy who I just interviewed. We were mentioning astrotheology. He just came on recently. Very nice fellow, but I let him talk and I was very patient. And I don't know if you saw that, guys, but he pretty much was saying the 144,000 Israelites in Revelation was the 144 chakras of the human. And I'm like, so I asked him very nicely, where did you, like, what made you think chakras all of a sudden? Well, there's 10 holy sciences, and he went into this thing and I was like, I don't know why someone would jump from that to this. I can give you alternative explanations that actually make better sense than that jump. And I think the scholars are trying to be careful, like you said, but there's also a sense, as I recently had M. David Litwell come on to correct Bart Ehrman on saying only one pneuma birth, and it's Jesus. And Litwell's like, what are you talking about? Actually, we know from Plutarch, he talks about the pneuma birth of Plato, who was from a virgin birth. So it's like, so there is competition, and there are scholars who are trying to do, I think, what you're describing, Lott, but aren't going the full Campbell route, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Coming from background in evolutionary biology, I mean, there's no, like, evolution makes this big step, right? But we have like DNA. We can say, okay, here, and we can show correlations in the genome and draw out the tree of life and show all the connections. But I guess the assumption just must be that this is also true of religion. It must be the case that religions are a kind of like inheritance model of mixing of ideas, and then there's resistance to inheritance in some insular groups, whatever. This whole logic of inheritance, it just must be the nature of religion, because that's the nature of humans, right? We have come from common ancestors and kind of early small groups and then spread out. And so our ideas must also have spread out and evolved in the same way. So in the end, this must be the correct like explanation for the origin of religion. It's the evolution of religion, just like the evolution of biology. It's just very hard to draw those links. Yeah, like we don't have as much of a DNA. Like I remember sitting in my Hebrew class and studying that, like the word for like human in Sanskrit is like aham, right? And then like it's Adam in Hebrew, and I'm like, wow, these are like really closely related, but you can get trapped in false etymologies and that kind of thing. But I guess it just must be true that all these things are linked. But it's just,
I hate to say it, but I was reminded of Ralph Ellis for a moment there. Like, just being honest, he connects stuff. I'm like,
well, even with linguistics, people can get carried away when, like, I just had a PhD, Luke from the channel Polymathy. I don't know if you guys heard of him. Brilliant, expert in languages. He's fluent in Greek, ancient Greek, Latin, you name it.
Coptic. Luke is awesome.
Yeah, he showed me that the words theos and dios are in fact not etymologically connected. So sometimes words, even if they look the same, sound the same, and have the same meaning, they even they have different origins. They just come together and then they start getting used the same way. But like that's one of the examples. But so yeah, even with linguistics, when we think we have a nailed slam dunk connection, it might not be there. But I was going to go back to what you were saying about the Campbell thing, which I love. Hero with a Thousand Faces, great reading, great stuff. But you know what I think did a great job in that vein was James Frazier, and James Frazier shows the connection between the rituals that are happening and the Adonis cults and the Attis cults and he gets a lot of flack for being outdated because it is an older book from a long time ago. But I almost wonder what do people think about James Frazier that's outdated? Because I think when I read James Frazier, I think there's a lot of stuff in there that just it's great. Like I like it. What do you guys think about that? Anyone? I don't know if anyone's read James Frazier stuff.
I haven't. Jason?
Hey, Dr. Lott, do you have any thoughts on this?
I'm not familiar with James Frazier. Is he doing similar kind of connective anthropology stuff to?
Yeah, he was a mythicist from England in the late 19th century. I think was it early 20th century maybe. Early.
Yeah, it was kind of in between. Frazier is interesting in that he's for me. I've never really been a big proponent. I did read The Golden Bow. It's part of my religious studies requirement back in college. But as far as Frazier goes, Frazier is kind of, I think, in the academy and then just in my own personal opinion, I've never been a big fan of him because he's representative of this Enlightenment kind of way of thinking in which Dr. Lott was talking about evolutionary biography. They kind of took that and they tried to apply it to the social sciences and to religion. And I don't think it really worked because it tends to take this viewpoint and put this magnifying glass on cultures and view them kind of as evolving from primitivism to the Enlightenment that we are, as opposed to just taking them on their own terms. So that's my thought on Frazier. Just I wanted to get back to what you were talking about in terms of Joseph Campbell, Dr. Lott.
Yeah,
I've never really put much credence into Campbell. I put much more credence. Let's not forget that Joseph Campbell, he was a big student of Mircea Eliade, right? So Mircea Eliade, the monomyth was kind of his thing. And Joseph Campbell just took that and popularized it, right? So I think with me, it's kind of the same thing as with this idea about the evolution of religion versus just looking at it on their own terms. We just have to read these texts and understand that these people are at the same time very familiar, but also incredibly different. I love Mircea Eliade, but I tend to be more of a disciple of Jonathan Z. Smith nowadays, just in terms of the concepts of comparison. Comparison is not genetic. A comparison is interesting because of the differences that it entails, right? So that's just my personal little take on it. I mean, everybody's free to have their own little.
And I think with Joseph Campbell, he really highlights that whether these stories that are being handed down, there is like a process happening, and it's that they some people call it that the hero's journey. There's something about a character coming from a certain origin, going through a certain passion, having a certain fall, and then a rise. Something about that sequence of events that just captures the human, it just captures people. And in fact, this was amazing to hear. George Lucas actually used the hero's journey for Star Wars. So Joseph Campbell influences Star Wars. That's how good Joseph Campbell is.
It goes even further than that. Interesting story about Steve Jobs. He's trying to sell Macs in the 80s or sell Apple computers. Completely fails. He's trying to sell. He takes this big ad and talks about how awesome the computer is and how you want to get this computer because it's awesome. He actually leaves, gets edged out. However, that ended up working out. Goes and founds Pixar, right? And he gets into storytelling, gets into the hero with 1,000 faces. This whole framework comes back and realizes what he was doing was he was putting the computer in the role of the hero, in the hero's like structure, and instead shifts to putting the hero in the mentor, or the computer in the mentor structure and the customer in the hero structure. And so now you're the genius. Now this is enabling you. The customer is the hero. And so he brings Campbell, and like now it's the largest market cap company in the world. And he's bringing this hero's journey model to selling computers. It's just to marketing, right? To like, yeah.
And you almost got to wonder, is Gnosticism indirectly influencing the film industry? And let me explain why I'm guessing that. Carl Jung, if you read his Red Book, he's pretty much what you would call a modern Gnostic. He's using these Gnostic language and approach with this dualism, with Satan and Jesus both having equal power, and like the idea of Abraxas being the embodiment of effect and a demiurge creator. So he has all these ideas floating around in his Red Book that wasn't meant for the public. That was his own personal diary. It was called the Black Books. And then they took the Black Books and they brought it down to a Red Book. And then that's the Red Book. Anyways, that's who Joseph Campbell is using for all his archetype stuff. He cites them in Hero of 1,000 Faces at least 50 times. Maybe, I don't know, maybe at least a dozen or more times. Carl Jung is being mentioned in that book. And so what I'm saying is that the Gnostic structure plays a role in good stories, right? I mean,
well, one thing that got me the most about Campbell was how he was kind of trying to point us to what the new kind of thing is for religion that we're moving into here in a kind of like postmodern or modern in his time kind of world, in response to science and the way it's kind of been upending things. And he tells this story about how when he started teaching, he was going to take these students that would come into his class and show them how all their stuff was derivative and garbage, and like it was not, none of it was like this, like theirs was the truth kind of thing. And he said that his experience went like the people came in and their religions were already in pieces in their hands. And when he showed them these connections between the various world religions, they pointed to like a deeper meaning, and they kind of reinvigorated their symbols for them. And that was kind of my experience too, going through Campbell's stuff. Right. And it asks this, but he asks this important question, I think, where do we go from here? If this is all not what or evangelical or mainline, my background is mainline Protestant coming up. If it's not this, cosmology of like powers and principalities that's real, then how do we move into a new world? Like our cultural systems are still built on this framework, but our science and what we now know about the cosmos is just completely shattered this way of thinking about the world. And we're in this kind of like liminal period here where we're trying to come to something new. And Campbell was, he didn't know what it was going to be. But it's going to be derived from our old thing. It's going to be using old images. And so I thought that was always an interesting question as well. It's not so much the history question we get a lot, but it's kind of like maybe more what the film industry is trying to do to create new mythologies, new stories, new ways of exploring, what's important to us and what we are.
And along the ideas of the Gnostic stories, right, in film, you almost think there's an element of Gnosticism to any good story, right? Like the world, you're looking at it differently than you did before, right? So that's like the world isn't as you thought it was, right? So
it's almost Plato's cave in a way that still plays into the Gnostic.
Absolutely.
And I use that analogy as someone who's not a believer anymore. I still believe in stories, right? So like, I think narratives are good to spin and to have. And I love that Plato's cave narrative that I use it all the time.
Absolutely. Derek is completely spot on there. You have to understand that when we talk about Gnosticism, I don't particularly subscribe, to a group of people that were Gnostics besides perhaps the Sethian Gnostics. So when you think of like what Elliot was saying, the Gnostic myth is essentially the Sethian myth, right? The Sethian Platonic treatises that you find in Apocryphon of John, Reality of the Rulers, On the Origin of the World, Gospel of Judas, right? Something Bentley Layden, Dylan Burns, and a few others have always pointed out, John D. Turner. This concept is, you have the emanation, and then you have the fall, and then you have the creation of those demiurge figures, and then they create the human, but then the human still needs like something from above to, imbue it with soul, spirit. So that's Sophia, right? Wisdom, Eve, spiritual Zoe. And like Neal was saying, it's a fantastic myth. And what we were talking about even before, like with Joseph Campbell, with Carl Jung, it goes before Jung. We didn't have these texts until 1945, right? But we still had the heresiologists.
Well, fun fact: Carl Jung was one of the first people to get his hands on in the public sphere. Carl Jung was one of the first people to receive one of these Nag Hammadi texts. Absolutely,
yeah. And Carl Jung was extremely influenced by these texts even before they were found by. I don't know if you know. There's a poet writer named Jorge Luis Borges. He was very influenced by Gnostic writing. Well, not necessarily writing, but just the ideas that you find in people like Irenaeus and all the heresiologists. He really loved these ideas, and this is where Jung was drawing from. Yeah, Philip K. Dick even. So it was ideas that are around, and I think we find that mostly in it's such a great story today. I mean, you find it in the Matrix, but strangely enough,
yeah, exactly.
My favorite Gnostic movie is the Lego movie, because the Lego movie.
Okay.
The Lego movie has the same kind of concept of middle management, a demiurge above. It's somebody opening their eyes who has this divine Sethian spark within. It's a very fantastic story. I think it's just the idea that just keeps on giving. It's the hero with 1,000 faces for the outsider among us.
I reinterpret the cave a little. Of course, I'm not thinking in Platonic forms, but you kind of have to know that if you're going to know the Plato's cave. But it's like I'm still thinking of the experience of someone in front of a wall, looking at the shadows on the wall, thinking this is real, coming to find out it's an illusion. It's not really what I thought it was. And then seeing light for the first time and going, oh, and now I'm going back in trying to free people. And I use the chains to represent any form of fundamentalism. I don't care if you believe. You can have your mythos. It's the fundamentalist fangs that I want to shred apart, because I think people can have that freedom and joy. But getting to that point, one of my favorite movies, and you probably wouldn't have thought about this. Maybe you have. I don't know. I think I'm kind of original in this thought. The first Iron Man. When he is ignorant, he's such an ass. And then he goes into the cave. He's got a shard near his heart. The guy's supposed to die. Next thing you know, he like heals himself and realizes the reality of what's going on. He comes out a hero with a armor and iron, and he's blasting the enemies down. But like it's a form of Plato's cave, and he's in a cave. So I'm like, this is pretty interesting. I don't know.
I would completely agree, because you look at Tony Stark from where he is in the first Iron Man 2, where he ends up in Endgame. He really is like a Gnostic savior in a way. Like he goes from being this completely self-absorbed, selfish, earthy person to like, I don't want to spoil it, but those who have ears to hear, they will hear. So, but yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with that, Derek.
Well, yeah, there's something about the apotheosis thing that you'd see in a lot of these early Christian groups, especially with the Carpocratians. Carpocratians had, like, what talks about how they had a statue of Plato, a statue of Jesus, a statue of Pythagoras, and they even deified some of their members, one of them being Carpocrates, one of the most attested apotheosis events in world history. We know
that was Epiphanies. Sorry, Neal.
Epiphanies.
Epiphanies. Carpocrates' son.
Thanks for correcting that. But so what I think was good with what's going on here is that when you attained apotheosis, which is like the highest form of gnosis that you can possibly attain, you've become the form of yourself that was intended by the Creator. You are the perfect form of you have just exited from the loop of transmigration. and now you are a god, basically. So they need to make a shrine for you so people can give offerings to you, because you are someone that people need to invoke for help so they can become apotheosis. That idea, it's almost like we do that almost indirectly with people who we look up to, people who are heroes in the world, people who are great, Martin Luther King or whoever. Like, they it's almost like we deify them because they deserve it, and we look up to them and we look at their deeds and we try to emulate those deeds. It's kind of a powerful thing if you think about it, whether you're atheist or not. There's something about that.
And it's very Buddhist, isn't it, with the bodhisattva, that you can enlighten other people, right? You're not going to ascend quite yet, right? You're going to bring other people with you, and people can look at you as the Buddha.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I guess it would be indirect, but like the transmigrations that come from the Pythagoreans and the Platonists. And then over on the East, they just call it reincarnation, but it's a very similar idea, because you don't want to be reincarnated. It's not you don't want that. It's not like we're going to be reincarnated, it's all great. They actually look down on it. You don't want to be reincarnated. You want to attain nirvana, and that's it. You want to be done. You want to exit this material realm. So the Gnostics and the Buddhists had that in common for whatever reason.
I mean, I'm sure there's some. This is the problem with genealogical connections, right? Is like maybe somewhere along during the trade route, somebody connected. I don't go so far as to act like, oh, well, we know we got to give all the credit. There's a guy online, I can't remember his name. Everything's Buddha.
Right.
Like, everything is Buddha. There's not a time that you can't just not say it's Buddha. And for me, it's like, look, okay, man, whatever floats your boat. I don't even criticize. It's just in my mind, I'm like, does everything have to be Buddha at this point? Oh, Homer's Iliad, Buddha, or like
Pythagoras.
I mean, you never know. Everything becomes Buddha.
Pythagoras and Buddha lived in the same century, but I mean, how would you what would be the logistics of Pythagoras traveling all the way to China and then going all the way back? And the story is that he went to Egypt and I think maybe Babylon, but like, do we know that, like, the story, like, to tie those two together, that would be kind of, I don't know if that's possible, but it's possible. I mean, anything is possible.
When I went into seminary, I was kind of had this idea that Buddhism basically was Christianity. Basically, was just cribbing from Buddhism, basically just copying a lot of this stuff over. And that's kind of the theory I went in there with, largely I think from looking at Campbell and looking at a bunch of Zen Buddhists that talk about parallels and these kind of things. But then I kind of got a sense that there was a much deeper and older connection, and that there was a kind of underlying shared Hebrew story that actually had a lot in common as well, that goes back to very old texts that would have predated the Buddha and would have been more kind of connected with the shared Hindu ideas and things like that. And I think it's easy to make those kind of early connections and not see the deeper ones, because I think what you're seeing in kind of like how, I don't know, there are plenty of genes that are conserved. Like we share half of our genome with trees or strawberries or something like that, because there are parts that have been kind of like preserved because they're so useful, and they've been preserved like from the beginning of life. Once I figured it out, it just stuck with it. And if you messed with that, the thing just died. It was so essential to it. And so I think that was one of those false etymologies, you might say, the connection between.
I like that analogy.
And Buddhism. I realized there was just a much older thing, and maybe that was what Jesus was pointing to, was a much older way of understanding the Hebrew philosophy that wasn't what was going on at the time, but he was trying to draw to orthodoxy, not create something new, and so I don't know. There's an example there of where trying to draw parallels. I totally eventually just got rid of that idea. I mean, I think they share similar ideas, but I think it's from a much older shared root.
If I might share, just for the title of this show, what makes Christianity fascinating without faith? I've said this before, and I'm a fan of Darren Brown, the mentalist, magician, and people like that really intrigue me, how they can purposefully deceive you and you think they really have powers that they don't really have, but they just know how the mind works. Or but I always paint this analogy. Either it's Plato's cave that I use for my coming out of fundamentalism and realizing there's a whole wide world of light that I've never seen, and that is what I love. Or the other analogy is I go to a David Blaine magic show. Everyone's an ooh and ah, David Blaine has magical powers. Look at what he does. He's levitating. He's this and that. And this guy in the corner, using the analogy, goes, "Psst, hey, you want me to show you what's behind the curtain?" And I'm like, kind of nervous, but sure, I'm a little afraid, but I think I'm willing to look and see. Look, I know you're afraid, but it's like the red pill in the Matrix. Once you eat this joker, okay, there's no going back. And I did. And then you see it and you think, oh, the magic trick. Boo. No, that is when it all starts. It's like, hold up. This is a human phenomena. This is something that is intriguing our experiences in narrative formats. And getting into all of this stuff is so much fun that you want to go back out into the crowd of all these people who believe David Blaine really has magic and say, hey, anyone interested in really seeing how he does the trick? Or are you just going to go on and just drink your, eat the cracker, drink your wine and go about your business? And I understand maybe most people just need to drink their wine and eat their cracker and go about their business. But if you really want to get down into the nitty gritty, now you know why MythVision exists. Now you know why Gnostic Informant exists. Now you know why Lord Sobek is out here doing what he's doing. Like it's amazing. And we have different perceptions. All three of us, if we drew a picture, it'd look completely different, but we may have had common influence. And so that's what makes it fascinating is as soon as you roll over a stone, you think you figured it out. And you're like, oh, Roman imperial cult influence here in the Gospel of Mark. It's clear he's trying to compete with the Julio-Claudio line. Next thing you know, you see Dionysus or you see some obscure esoteric thing out here and you're like, whoa, hold on. Like, I thought I figured it out. And there's just so much more to uncover. And there's almost 2 billion people on planet Earth who believe the religion. So it fascinates me, as someone said earlier before we hit record, Star Wars, look at the religion around Star Wars that has developed. And it's known as a myth. It's not historical. There is a religion surrounding this very myth. And I love it. It's cool.
A force religion. Yep. You know what's interesting about that is you almost have to wonder, in 2,000 years from now, will people look back and say the force they were taking it seriously. I wonder if it's real. And then people might say, well, in the year 2012 or 2020 or whatever, their people were actually doing this stuff, and maybe it is, and then you might have something like that going on. You know what I mean? You never know.
Yeah. With the stage magic analogy, there's this magic trick with Penn and Teller. It's on YouTube. So first they do the trick and everything, like you're not seeing what they don't want you to see. Then they redo the trick, but now it's like in plexiglass. And that is amazing. Like it's so much cooler where they show you what's happening behind the scenes, that like they're just quick moving this way and that way, and you're made to assume that this is a foot, but it's not. And I think without believing it, like it's not legit, but then you find out the trick behind it. That's where it's really cool.
I always do this crude analogy. I'm a big fan of wrestling. And wrestling has never been real to me since I was 12 years old, but I've always been a fan of wrestling since then because of the behind the scenes aspect of it. I like breaking the kayfabe. I like seeing what the marks aren't seeing. And that makes it infinitely more interesting just to understand the social dynamics behind wrestling and what's going on there. And it's the same thing with Christianity. Just full disclosure, I've never been an atheist, but I've never been a Christian. So it's never been about like I was reacting against something. If I was reacting against anything, it was my dad wanting me to do music because I took like 5 years of music lessons and just like all this stuff when I was a kid. So I was supposed to be like into music. And then like I was just taking college classes, just like kind of like a fuck off until like, I learned music management, all that stuff. And recording and all that stuff. And then I picked up this book and it was about, I just needed an elective. So I just, or another class. So I took a world Western civilization won. And I was really blown away by Gilgamesh. And at the same time, I was also reading, well, I wasn't reading, but I was watching a lot of The Last Temptation of Christ just as a movie. I really loved it. And then I saw this thing on PBS called From Jesus to Christ. And that blew me away because I saw John Dominic Crossan and I saw all these people, and they were just, I was like, you can look at this just from a purely scholarly sociological perspective. And that's what I wanted to do after that. I just completely changed my major to like history and religious studies. And that's always been what the, why this has always been my third passion in life, next to my son and music. Just, I love to look at these people and at this sociological phenomenon because they have the same hopes and fears that we do. They have the same thinking. The one Dr. Gus Lott was talking earlier about, you know, there's certain things that people have in common throughout history, no matter what, right? And I think the ultimate thing is we're always going to disagree on something. And Christianity is the ultimate example of that. People are always disagreeing, but also behind these texts, you can see what's going on there, right? Like where they're borrowing, they're in a culture, they're not cut off from each other. They're all interacting. Like one of the things that people are, scholars are more willing to admit is that the Neoplatonic philosophers and the Vitae are just as much in communication with Christian literature as vice versa. So they're both taking from each other. You look at somebody like Porphyry, Plotinus. Porphyry and Plotinus know Hebrew apocalypses. They know what these texts are. Dr. Sledge did a great video about this not too long ago, but also Dylan Burns, who's one of my favorite scholars, he wrote a book called Apocalypse of the Alien God, and it's all about how Plotinus is telling you in his Aeneads that these guys were, these Gnostic Sethians were, Platonic Gnostic Sethians were friends of mine, and I just have to take him down a notch. He's familiar with all these texts. They're all familiar with these texts. You read something like
Porphyry too.
Neal, exactly. And Neal and I always nerd out about this, these lives of Plotinus, and who's the other one, Neal?
Iamblichus.
Yeah, all these guys. Yeah, and they're and like you have Proclus, Iamblichus, and they're all like levitating 10 feet off the ground and stuff. And
well,
they're doing exactly the same. Yeah, they believed it exactly. Yeah, and it's time we realize that these guys aren't insulated from each other. They're all borrowing from each other. They understand. I think Litwa, in my conversations with Dr. Litwa, he has actually said, I'm prepared to admit that, you know, the Vita of Iamblichus is who the person who wrote that. I can't remember what his name is off the top of my head, but he is very familiar with the Gospels. You know, you look at Lucian. Lucian knows Nonus. Lucian, in his true story, he is lifting directly from Apocalypse of Peter, from the Book of Revelation. He knows all these texts. He's not only knowing these texts and putting them in there, he's putting them on the same playing field as like he would like Homer or
I got the best example for you. I got the best example for you. One of the most famous texts. It's actually the longest. It's actually the longest. What is it? What are those texts called that Homer uses? The type of prose. Like, it's the longest. The longest example of that is known as Dionysica. And just to give you an example, what Sobek is talking about, this is how much the cultures were just all meshed into one little ball, because Dionysus, when he comes back after his rebirth, one of the things that he says in his, I think it's a chant, a Bacchic chant, because you know how there's Yake, there's Iwa, there's all these Bacchic chants. One of them, believe it or not, is Hallelujah, Amen. So Nonus in the 5th century, I think, is writing a story of Dionysus, and out of the lips of Dionysus are the words Hallelujah, Amen, which obviously comes from Christianity, but like he's making this Bacchic now. He's just saying, I'm taking that and making it Bacchic now. Like exactly. The worlds were all mixed together.
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, look at Zeus and Yahweh. Like in Hellenistic Judaism, I'm reading right now, like I've been reading Richard C. Miller's book, which is great. He's quoting Jonathan Z. Smith. There's all sorts of good names that keep coming up. Those always give me excitement. But he's mentioning the Jews literally in Hellenistic areas, and it wasn't always. It's usually in certain local pockets where you find they're like, yeah, Zeus Yahweh, yeah, same God, just a different. That's the Greek word for our God, and the Jewish word for Zeus is Yahweh. So. And you're like, whoa, dude, what are you saying? Like, yeah, the cultural diffusion. They're squishing it together and they're cool with it. It's awesome.
Diodorus of Sicily said that in 50 BC. He said,
yeah, you want to see that more on the ground level
Yahweh
too. Just look at the PGM.
Yeah, Yahweh is just the Jewish version of Zeus, basically. That's what he said.
And then you have Litwa with the evil creator, that the Egyptians looked at Hashem as Typhon Set. So they're like, oh, you guys worship the devil, like the guy that's doing all these plagues all the time. We know that God, so you worship him?
Well, it'd be certain Egyptians. That's the problem. It's like if you went to Egypt around these periods, it would not be homogenous. It would be like maybe certain pockets, Manetho, obviously, but like if we're going down into the 1st century, 80, 2nd century, 3rd century, man, Christianity is all over that joker too. So there's probably competitive sex going on and different ideas. It's really cool.
Yeah, and if we believe with like the Hyksos origins of the ancient Hebrews.
Well, the interesting thing about that.
Oh yeah.
The interesting thing about the Hyksos is that if you look at Josephus, if you look at Philo, they're not denying that. That's not the issue with them. They're not. We don't come from the Hyksos. The issue is that they're trying to say we are not misanthropic people who are cut off from the rest of the culture. And then later in Josephus, he's saying, yeah, I mean, he's Apion, who was somebody who during the reign of Caligula was on the embassy, the rival embassy with Philo, right? He said that Judaism is a breakaway from a more ancient religion, so therefore its antiquity cannot be trusted. And Josephus is like, no, I mean, you say yourself that we're descended from Hyksos, right? So they have no problem with this. It's very strange.
Yeah, let me say something about this, because people talk about the Hyksos thing, and so scholars are in their bubble because they're a lot of these things are settled, and like it almost looks like scholars are like not engaging with what people online are saying sometimes, especially with mythicism. This is an example of that. So scholars are saying that the Exodus we don't have evidence for the Exodus. And then so a lot of online amateurs will say, but Josephus says that the Hyksos are the Hebrews. Slammed up. So does Manetho. What are we doing? Why are the scholars know this? It's not like they don't. You think the first person to find that text that no scholar knows? No, it's not what they're saying. What they're saying is the stories of the Hyksos being connected to the Israelites is not what's being rejected. What's rejected is the story of the Exodus of millions of people leaving overnight and for 40 years in the desert running around. That's not the same as saying the Hyksos were exposed and then over centuries, 500 years, slowly over time, the Israelite community forms. That's two different things. So when Josephus is talking about the Hyksos being the pre-Israelites, yeah, there is some truth to that, but that's not the same thing as saying therefore an exodus, a mythological exodus happened. Two different things there. That's my take on that. The only reason why I'm saying that like that, because I've noticed a lot of people online will like say these scholars are saying that the Hyksos are not but here look. It's like, slow down a little bit. We know Josephus said that. We know Manetho said that. We're not denying that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, you go back and read somebody like Philo, and it's really, let's just say, insane. The stuff these guys are saying, it would blow people's minds.
I'll give you an example. Josephus said that there's a boat on top of Mount Ararat in Turkey, and it's the boat that Noah was in. And we have it. It physically exists, and it's there. Josephus is saying that. You think that's true? You honestly think that's true? No. But Josephus he probably heard that from somewhere, and he wrote it down.
Yeah, seems to be common origin myths. You always stretch back. I mean, didn't Plato write this in his dialogues and mention, like, you want a civilization that's going to be successful, rooted as far back as you can, even if there isn't a genealogical connection, create one. Oh, we have a genealogy, actually. Methuselah lived 969 years. Did you not know? Connect it back to the first man. You have an ancient civilization, because the number one thing that is respected, for some reason, this is ubiquitous as well, humans like respect old. We look at it and ooh. In fact, I bet you in Dr. Lott's profession, and especially with like people who are digging up fossils, the older you're more like impressed. You're like, whoa, you 7 million years? You know, like there's something about age. And I think that psychologically that works too. The Romans respected, to some degree, they respected Judaism.
Are you guys hearing that? There's a loud swishing noise. It's like really loud. I don't know whose mic it is.
I think it might be me. Oh,
I just don't want to. I didn't mean to cut you off, Derek, but I don't know if you, Derek.
No, I can't hear it. I can't hear it.
It's pretty loud. I don't know. Maybe it's just maybe it's my headphones then.
Yeah, but just I like where you're going at it. I think they're stretching back. I would imagine even the Greek origins, talking about Atlantis or anything as old, as far back as you can, to give the gods some street cred, or your own tribe street cred. The Athenians, and they're descended from the deities. Like, you know, there's all sorts of fun stories. I wouldn't have given a crap about any of this if I was still a fundamentalist. So if I was a fundamentalist, I would only be talking about how those were actually derived from demonic sources, or like, you know, kind of pull off, this is evil. Satan planted those dinosaur fossils. God created the earth 7,000 years ago. What's wrong with you?
You guys don't hear that? Honestly, I'm hearing like loud noises right now.
No, I hear it now.
Yeah. It's like,
here, you know, my heater is going. Maybe I can just turn it off real quick. Maybe that's it.
I don't know.
I'll be right back.
Or you can always mute in the middle. Yeah. We'll keep it going. We'll keep the convo going, so the show still goes on. So yeah, I was just gonna say, oh, by the way, another thing about people using Josephus as a citation for the Exodus. Josephus is still almost 2,000 years or 1,500 years removed from when the Exodus would have, or no, not
without a doubt,
over 1,000, 1,300, like that. He's still far. Josephus is not a primary source for the Exodus.
No, but the motivated reasoning behind why he's doing it, I find interesting. He's dealing with competition. There's competitive, like, no, dude, our Greeks, our Roman civilization, the Aeneid, right? Our civilization is the one with the greatest laws. There's a book, Jews and the Roman Rivals. Here it is. This one right here. And if you haven't read that, Cattell Berthelot got a Jewish award, actually, an academic Jewish award. Highly recommend reading this. I read it for some weird reason, which I'm not going to get into here, but it helped me see things that I'm like, I'm so glad that I read this book, because I would not have realized that Jews were in competition. They had to like say, ho, 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 our daddy beat up your daddy. And how do I know? Because Moses taught Plato. Don't tell me Plato taught Moses, you know, or whatever.
And that's what they said too.
They did.
The Orphic said, no. Orpheus taught Moses,
right?
And then the Philo's like, no, Moses taught Orpheus. It's the other way around.
And you see this even in the myth of Moses having an apotheosis. The Bible says he's dead. Like, he went and he died he didn't enter the land. He died. God took care of him, pretty much saying God buried him. What does Philo do? What does Josephus do? They say Moses was taken up. Why was he taken up? Maybe because Romulus was taken up. Maybe because Alexander the Great and your heroes, your gods, your Caesars were taken up. I would suspect that this is why they then have Moses get taken up. So it's competition, and it's cool how they're creating nonsense. And I say nonsense not like it isn't fun to get into, but it's not literally true. It's like they're making up stuff to be in competition with each other.
But believe it or not, this is fascinating, because the Orphics were big into this. In Homer, or no, I'm sorry, in Plato's Apology, Socrates points out that Orpheus and a man named Musaeus, and he says, wouldn't you want to be learning from Orpheus and Musaeus? So a lot of the Orphics, and even Diodorus of Sicily says that this Musaeus character, there was a guy named Musaeus, and he was a student of Orpheus. So this has nothing to do with Judaism yet.
Right.
So when later on people are looking at this stuff and saying, wait a minute, they're talking about Moses. Yeah, so they have evidence. They have something to look at. They have sources. They you know what I mean? It's funny. It's just funny how that works. But you see the same thing today. People digging in the sources, digging in the text, and trying to find those. Look, we found it. We got it. You know.
Jason,
you muted, Jason.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Neal and I like to nerd out on the Hebrew Bible pseudepigrapha volumes by Charles Worth,
which I see Gus Lott has behind his head right now.
Yeah, there we
go.
It's a good site. Yeah, I love Charles Worth, man. He's my guy.
Yeah, such amazing stuff. Such a paramount scholar. But like, there was a genre just full of like florilegium or sayings, fake Greek sayings, right, from their poetry and from their plays about things foretelling of Judaism and how great it is. You know, it was a whole genre back then. This predates Christianity by hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's not new. It's just something that Christianity or the early Jesus associations adapt. And
by the way, not to change the subject, but what's that manuscript that you got behind you, Gus?
Oh, it's beautiful. I love this one. It's the Song of Songs, chapter 2.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's actually the last page of the Aleppo Codex of what remains after it was. I don't know if you're familiar with that codex. It was our oldest complete Hebrew Bible, and it is in like the 1940s. It was lost, and the place it was stored was burned down, and then it appeared like a decade later, but like I don't know, 40% of it was missing. And so most of the Torah, that kind of thing. But this is the last page of it over here. Yeah, no, I think it's really beautiful Hebrew. I love I think the person that wrote that page was doing some really beautiful kind of like word art in it that had the kind of like divine. They was trying to invoke God in ways, because the name of God is not mentioned in this book at all. It's like, I don't know if you're familiar where they are, but it and I think Esther are the only books that don't have some mention of God. And so anyway, there's a long story to that, but I think the author of that page, the scribe that wrote it, knew a really beautiful piece of kind of like hidden word poetry that was woven into this text that he indicates it in this page. Yeah.
You'll have to watch the interview where we talk about that.
I was just going to say to Dr. Lott before we move on, Hebrew Bible has never been my wheelhouse. I took some classes on it in college, but my mentor was a huge Hebrew Bible. She was a huge Hebrew Bible expert, but my favorites are always the later prophets and Song of Songs, things like that. Before you get into Maccabees, like intertestamental literature, the later stuff, the earlier stuff, I'm not as proficient in, but Song of Songs is definitely dope. Esther's dope. Love it. So, thank you for
awesome
that.
Yeah, one thing about the history of things, I think it's interesting, the time we live in where our kind of cosmology has been rewired by the most recent thing. Like essentially the scientific cosmology has essentially discarded these old cosmologies. And so then and people are like, okay, so there's relativity and the Big Bang and all this kind of stuff. That's kind of how we now view the emptiness of space. It's no longer this anthropomorphic thing. And it's been kind of, I don't know, that's kind of a shift from this way of saying, oh, my thing is older than your thing. My God's greater than your God kind of thing. It's more like, well, this is just from like 90 or 110 years ago when Einstein put, general relativity out there and quantum field theory. They just found the Higgs boson, under a decade ago. And so like, what? Yes, it's a completely different shift. But I do think that people still respond to this kind of like tools for living. If you're going to say that religion might fit in that category, like how do I live my life? that they'll respond to like older tried stuff as opposed to whatever like kind of new thing that's been hacked together, today. But that is one of the things I feel like you lose when you do kind of take the red pill in the Matrix sense, and see behind the curtain, is you kind of lose a system that holds you and carries you. And it's something I struggle with as a father, raising young kids. Like, okay, so they're not getting this mythic archetypal framework that lets them make sense of the world in terms of like anthropomorphic ideas. They don't believe, I think like John Calvin believed that God's hands were holding back the water because Aristotle's physics says that rock sinks in, or earth sinks in water. And so the only reason we weren't just covered up in a flood is because God's hands were there doing it. And he just like believed that about the world. And, it's complete delusion, but it's tough to, my parents keep on telling me, you gotta make like rituals for your kids and these kind of things. You essentially have to invent religion. So great. I know all these like details of the structure of how religions are made, and I can invent them, and I can invent these things, and I can do a trick. I can be a Penn and Teller, or I can be a David Blaine, but I know it's not real. I can't like be held by this thing that I've created. And I can't really, I don't think, convey that to my kids. I'm not going to sit there and like fool them, just for this. And so I don't know, that's one thing that I struggle with a lot about what the new thing is and how it might relate to the old things. And so I don't know, a lot of what I try to do in communicating science and religion and these kind of things is I do try to point back and say, these ideas are not new. They've been struggled with for a long time. And these stories, though they were derivative and connected and related, they're talking about things that we still struggle with today. And I guess that's what ultimately preachers try to do. But I think that's also true. It's not just all BS. Right? Like, I think that the idea of the resurrection to me is something that I think sucks to get thrown out with the bathwater. Like I was reading the Gospel of Philip and he's like, okay, so some people think that the resurrection happens after you die. And then he says, no, you have to be resurrected first and then you die. Like he's just talking about it in this way. And they're like clearly talking about it as this meaning of a way of coming alive when you were formerly walking around dead. And it's this way of thinking about the world that brings you to that just animates you in a really powerful way. And it's not just, well, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. That's it. And now I'm going to live forever and I'm good. It's like, no, I have some realization right now that transforms how I see the world. Like waking up from the Matrix, like being pulled out of the cave. Mm-hmm. And I think there's something really there to these old stories that has that kind of ability to transform our life and to deal with suffering and these kind of things. And so exactly. I'm sad that it gets often tossed out with the bathwater in ways.
I love that. I'd love to explore that just a little bit further with you, because it really relays into my own experience. Like back when I was I was kind of telling you, like my rebellion wasn't against religion or anything. Like my rebellion was against music. Trying to have to do music because that's what my parents expected me to do since I was 13 years old, right? So I find I go to the Half Price Books. You live in Austin, right? You know Half Price Books?
Yeah, but I did, yeah. But not,
okay.
Not yeah.
Okay, you did. Okay, sorry. Well,
I'm in New York State, yeah.
Okay. Well, they have this place called Half Price Books in Texas, in Austin. The one I went to had this really amazing, because it was right next to like a seminary, and they had all these really amazing like old used theology and Christian history and church history books and religious studies texts. So like I picked up a copy of Jesus Christ in Mythology by Rudolf Bultmann. And that just blew me away because he was doing exactly what you're talking about, except in philosophical terms, right? He was talking about Christianity as something that we need to take off the myth. And this is something that scholars today explore, but at that time it was groundbreaking, in the 20s, right? So he's talking about we need to demythologize the Gospels and break it down to the bare minimum of what it means for us existentially. And for him, it was Heideggerian, Martin Heidegger. He was using Martin Heidegger's existential tools. Him and Paul Tillich were really into that. I love Paul Tillich. Just as, somebody who has no faith, I could get into that because, you know, Paul Tillich and Rudolf Bultmann put God in terms of the God above God. There is a God above God and a ground of being and existence. And I could relate to that just as a person. So, and I just really wanted to acknowledge what you were talking about there. It really speaks to my own kind of experiences early in the early days. I basically had a conversion. I sold all my musical instruments, all my amps, all my guitars, all my keyboards. And I just like took that money and I went to the bookstore and I grabbed all these books. And I'm like, I want to read about this. I want to learn about Hildegard of Bingen. I want to read everything Rudolf Bultmann wrote, everything Paul Tillich did. And just, that's what I did for like 4 years in college.
It's interesting what you say here, Sobek, because when I went and interviewed, I'm a naturalist, physicalist, as you know. But I think we're speaking similar terms because we're using language to describe an experience. At the end of the day, I think like I have had an experience as well when I deconverted, where it was like I found myself. And Elaine Pagels, I mean, I don't know how to psychologically paint it other than I tell my mom, my wife, my family, when they're like, you don't believe we're all Christians. They're all Christians. And many of them are fundamentalists. My mom thinks hell's real, all that. Right. And like, it's like I scaled these hills. And at the end, there's a mirror. And I just get to the end and I'm looking at myself. I'm like, but it's not like, oh, you're looking at yourself. Like people could mock what I'm trying to say. What I did, it was like a deep moment of realization. It's you. It's you the whole time. This is you. You're that creative. This is how amazing this experience is. Well, Elaine Pagels, when I sat in her living room, she told me how she gave birth to her children in this home. She wrote all these books. She talked about the Nag Hammadi. I mean, I got like 30 recordings with her. I'm like at the feet of Elaine Pagels, right? And she's telling me about the Gospel of Thomas and the secret of what is really being taught in it. And she says, what I think is really going on is obviously Thomas is the twin. And it's supposed to be you. She's telling me some deep stuff, right? Like it's supposed to be you. And she's saying like, whenever you move that rock, I'm there. Whenever you go there, I'm there. Like the whole thing is I'm everywhere you are because I'm you. And it's a really interesting way of like a mirror again. And it's like, okay, hold on. Maybe the Gnostics are kind of onto something here. But I'm taking it and I'm reinterpreting it through a natural world, but saying my experience, I can relate through experience of finding meaning and purpose and value and having that kind of experience I suspect that you had, but saying, I'm not saying it really is something up there that did it. Whereas you might think differently about that, right? So,
well, I mean, it's the same thing, right? I mean, in a way, we're both discovering something about ourselves. And this is what's so interesting, I think, getting back to what Elliott's entire purpose of this stream is what's interesting about Christianity without faith. Mm-hmm. For me, it's I look at Christianity today almost as like Neal and I were talking about Neoplatonism and how Platonism, Middle Platonism, the early academy is very adaptive to its world, right? Christianity is the same. You could think of Christianity almost as like, in very crude terms, I like to play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons.
Absolutely.
And Christianity is almost like, think of it, Christianity is almost like a game engine that you can adapt. Like Dungeons and Dragons has a game engine that until very recently, people could adapt to their different needs and purposes and doing like their DMing, things like that. Christianity is the same. Christianity is just an engine. You have a game engine. You have some basic things that are exactly the same, but depending on where you are geographically, mentally, exactly right, vastly adaptable to vastly different things. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of how I see it. And yeah, Derek, we have very similar experiences in that sense. It's just there's something existentially grabbing about it, right? No matter whatever, however you learn. Like I think if I was raised a fundamentalist Christian, I would not give two shits about this stuff at all. I don't know, but like maybe I just always wanted to. But like when I got to college and I met my mentor, she was like, yeah, you need to read Cariton. Yeah, Mark is basically like lifting from Cariton, and you need to read Dennis MacDonald. He had a book at the time called the one about Acts of Peter and Mimesis. It was Christianizing Homer or something like that. Yeah. Like all these books. And she's like, social identity theory, you need to read this. Dr. Raphael, she's a brilliant, amazing person, still out there, still doing all that stuff, bringing that to people. And she's very important. Her and Dr. Elizabeth Mikowski, who was pretty much an expert in canon law and female saints. And they mentored me along all this stuff. And it's just like learning about the human dimensions of this was so much more important than thinking it came from the hand of some invisible spirit. You know, I can read Paul Tillich and I can be moved, like almost as a spiritual experience, but that has nothing to do with like me having faith in anything. It has to do with me existentially. I don't know,
like watching a good movie today, even like
yeah,
if you watch a good enough movie, you're going to go, wow. I mean, that really changed me or moved me or gave me an experience. I'm with you. I'm the same way when I learn this stuff. And I don't ontologically draw the conclusions many people do, but I'm like, I got something from that. You know, there's something cool that I can learn. And I think we should have that. Too often people in my camp just want to like mock and talk crap. And I'm trying to give them an actual advantage and saying, actually, you've got the leg up. If you actually study this stuff for what it really is, you're already on the winning side. It's really those who've taken this so literal so far in that way that actually they've missed the point. They've missed the whole baggage of what's going on here. So,
well said.
I'm really curious to know how Neal transfigured like that before our very eyes. I mean, I'm starting to wonder if he has powers.
Let the camera cool down a little. I'm in the process of getting a new camera because this one overheats and it started to do it. So I'm just letting it cool down a little bit. But you know, I was thinking on the topic of what's so fascinating about Christianity is discovering the stuff that the church wanted to forget about, which they accidentally preserved in the writings of Irenaeus and Hippolytus through refutation of the heresies. And when you actually read the stuff that these early Christians in the late first, early second, middle of second, third century, all the way up until they, you know, basically started this church, whatever this church is with the Nicene Creed, all these different groups of Christians that were not, they didn't call themselves Gnostics. They didn't call themselves heretics. They called themselves Christians. And some of their ideas are just so fascinating. Like I'm looking at one right now with these Nacenes are by far the most fascinating because the Nacenes are,
that was right in my head,
comparing. Oh, I got a big echo. They're comparing Jesus to Mercury, saying Mercury was the Logos. They're comparing Jesus to Attis and Osiris, and
that's the serpent. That's the serpent Christology, right?
Yeah. And so there's that that to me was mind blowing to know that the closer you get to Jesus, the more widespread, the more disagreeing there is, the more diversity there is among Christians. The farther you get from Jesus, the more everything is all the same. The more it's all, they believe in the Trinity and they believe in Jesus is the Son and he died for your sins. And that's all you got to do is believe that. And everything's fine. Like there's more commonality between Mormons and Catholics than there are between Christians in the 2nd century. And that's people might not understand what I mean by that. Go look at the different types of Christianities in the 2nd century, compare them, you will see even though that Mormons and Catholics are vastly different, they actually have more in common, in my opinion, than some of these early Christians did. Because they're so diverse.
Yeah, they believed that he had an actual body, which not everybody did, right? And you could almost think in where Jesus asks, "Who do you say I am?" Right? And maybe there were 5 other people that responded to that. Like, I think you're like a serpent, right? I think you're like I don't know. There's just a few edited out, right? That are just wild.
Yeah. Like the Nassim hymn. A lot of people know about the Nassim hymn. Mary Beard has a translation in her book. David Litwa just recently put that in his book. But even on top, the Nassim hymn, he literally just comes out and takes a Homeric hymn written for Attis. It says, the Egyptians call you Osiris. the Phrygians call you Attis, the Samothracians call you Adamus, and he's naming off all these different gods. Player of the pipes, Pan, Orpheus. Like, what? Jesus is all those things? And like even beyond, like if you go to Hippolytus, he lays out that hymn too. So does Irenaeus, but Hippolytus even goes deeper. And I'm looking at the text right now, and he's like, for Mercury is the Logos, the interpreter and fabricator of all things given by Zeus. And like, so he's basically saying like, yeah, Mercury was this mediator between Zeus and, so that must have been the Christ too. And then he's like, oh, Osiris. When you go to the temples and you look at Osiris, and I'm looking at the text right now, he's standing not only the most hallowed temples of the chief of idols, the information of all, it was the light not set under a bushel, but a candlestick proclaiming its message around the housetops. And he's talking about Osiris in this text. It's mind-blowing, but it's fascinating that these early Christians were looking around and saying, hey, look, we have the right one. We found all the things you guys are looking for. Stop looking. We found it. As Jesus. He's the real Christ. Osiris, yeah, that's cool. That's a good story. We like that story. But really what you're looking for is Jesus. That's the one.
Yeah, Cicero, actually. I was just reading this earlier today in De Natura Deorum, if that's how you pronounce it.
Yeah, on the gods. It's called On the Gods.
He says, come now, do we assert that the gods actually go by the same names that they are called by us? You know, like trying to say no. Yet the names of the gods are as many as the human language is spoken, for it is not an issue with the gods, but with us. You are Velius wherever you go, but Vulcan is not Vulcan in Italy and in Africa and in Spain. Now, it's not in the same vein of what you're saying specifically, but it's trying to say kind of the syncretism of your God. They're really all similar reflections of really the same God. In a way, it's Hellenism on steroids, trying to connect the different deities. Oh, well, you call him Zeus. Well, we call him Yahweh. Well, you... And that's literally what was going on. And I'm reading this amazing book, if you haven't read it yet, by Richard C. Miller. It's like you guys literally knew I was going to be reading this book when this show came on, you know?
Yeah, Cicero is really indicative of this movement in Stoicism at the time. People think that the allegorical method started with, the church fathers. It's farthest thing from the truth. Stoicism really kind of created this whole thing. And Cicero is very paradigmatic of this, and it's just something that Middle Platonism and later Neoplatonism would take up, and of course the Church Fathers later. But yeah, Cicero is very much in that allegorical method. Like Neal, we were talking to Dr. Litwa about Cornutus, right, the other day.
Yeah,
and just that whole thing. So yeah, it all comes from Stoicism. Stoicism kind of invents the allegorical method. So
yeah, and by the way, you Derek just cited I forgot the Latin that you just said, but it's called On the Nature of the Gods.
Yeah,
and I love that book. It's a very short read, very easy to read, and I don't know if he's hosting a debate, but it's like a Platonic dialogue. But you have a skeptic and a pagan duking it out and debating on the gods and are they real or not. And like you almost get the sense of what Cicero is trying to say. There's a middle way. Like you can still derive wisdom from these myths. You don't have to just ditch the myths, but you don't have to believe in them either. So it's a really interesting, valuable book that I think people today can even get something out of. Cicero was great.
Yeah, Cicero, Seneca. Look up those dudes were fire, right, Neal?
Yeah.
Along those lines about equating a bunch of gods with each other, that if you're familiar with Mithraism and originating with Cilician pirates, so there's when Rome was a bit weak, they didn't really have much of a naval power, so pirates took over the Mediterranean, and I forget who, Plutarch says that was the origin of Mithraism.
He says in 67 BCE, Pompey found a bunch of art when he defeated the pirates that they were Mithras. He even gives you the date and everything. Well, he doesn't say 67 BCE, but he says in the year of the consulship of blah 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 blah, and then we can date that to 67. That's what I meant by that. But
yeah, and so they'll have Mithra from Zoroastrianism, which is kind of like Mercury. He goes between the light and the dark. And then they conflate him with Atlas. He's on the outside of the globes doing the precession of the seasons. And he's like, what's the god of war in Greece? The Eris? Do we have and then, so he's born from a rock, just like other gods are born from like an egg. And conflation of Perseus and Orion, and he's just all these gods built into one, has all of their traits. And you think with the pirates, they were all over the place, right? They were in Persia, they were in Rome, they were everywhere, that they could get that syncretism, right? And then you almost wonder if that's what religion is about, right? You're talking a language and you're kind of coming up with something.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've enjoyed about getting into the comparative religion thing is looking at it like having two eyes on your face, right? And it's the differences that are important. If you wink an eye back and forth, it's the differences that give depth. If there's no change, you just can't tell how deep it is, right? And so you can actually see this deeper thing when you see the differences and the similarities, obviously, too. Yeah, I think that's fascinating. That I like how it appears, how they kind of wield this today in if they make a TV show where it's like Star Trek and you've got some cluster of gods that are the characters in the story, but they're all rarefied archetypes of the human condition and some subset, and they use it to tell a story, and then, or you have another show that has a different set of characters that are different, like pure archetypes of different aspects of the human condition. And then if you want to tell a story about some part of humanity, you just crash those gods against one another. And it's pretty much the same thing that is going on with the Greek myths. They've got their rarefied archetypal, here's war, here's your beauty, and here's, your wisdom. And, you've got all these things are laid out in the gods. And then you wield them to tell a story about the human condition. And I think that's something that just television today does very well. And I think they've taken that from Jung and Joseph Campbell. They all read that stuff when they get trained in how to do that. And so I don't think you can do that unless you really realize that's what's happening. They're kind of like masks on aspects of our condition that kind of like break it out, kind of like a coordinate system. Like in math, you have like X, Y, and Z, and those are just a way of like mapping this space out and letting you relate to it. And I think that's exactly what these gods are in these old stories. I think it's really cool to be able to see how different people used different sets of archetypes, and I think that defines their culture in a way, right? The way that if you're watching Star Trek, or you're watching Friends or whatever, it's like these are two different sets of archetypal individuals, and they relate differently to people in different ways, and they essentially define the culture of the people that are watching the different shows and how they relate to them, how you feel like you map onto that set of gods.
Yeah. I like that analogy of the differences make you see in 3D, or what allows you to see in 3D. That would preach well, I think, on the Gospels.
Yeah. Creeds are just they're terrible. Everybody says I believe the same thing, when it's really like, well, what is the difference here? Like in a kind of non-normative way. What do you believe? Not so that everybody else can believe it, but so that we can see depth beyond either of us. I think it's really, it does. I found it preached pretty well. Yeah.
Yeah. So here, we should start wrapping up. I know some of us have to go here in a few minutes, but any final thoughts that we didn't get to?
Yeah, I'll just say that it's not that I'm doing what Cicero did and looking to these myths is like this ultimate wisdom, but I am appreciating them for the historical value, and because I like to look at where human evolution of ideas come from. So I do respect the text. I don't just poke fun at them and laugh at them and try just to debunk them. Although I do take a very critical approach. Definitely. I think it's important to do that, in my opinion. But at the same time, it is who we are. It is where we came from. It is where a lot of these ideas come from. So I do I don't try to impose my modern worldview onto these texts and try to correct it all. But I just think it's interesting, and it's a fun ride, and it's fascinating. So
mine's a double-edged sword where I am trying to literally combat fundamentalism. I do have I am very motivated. Anybody who knows that, I'm very motivated in actually trying to show you, oh, you think he was really born of a virgin by the pneuma of God, and that Herod the Great really is trying to kill all the newborn infants? Well, let's read Suetonius, Lives of the Caesars, the Divine Augustus, and I'll show you an identical trope, not identical narrative. The story is so similar. Instead of it being Herod trying to kill these people, you have the Senate. Instead of like Sanhedrin wanting Jesus to be dead, you have the Senate that wants to kill the newborn child that they're rearing up that year because nature has said they're going to bring forth a king, yada, yada, yada. And like my point is I do want people to see this is a trope. This is something that is influential, that is powerful in narrative and story, but it isn't literally true. And the reason I'm combating that is we have people running around knocking on doors and going out there making YouTube videos telling you, if you don't believe, you're going to hell forever. And my mom literally believes this. No matter what I tell her, she literally believes this and cannot get it through that this is not literally true.
And it's influencing policy and government.
Oh, so many things.
Stuff. Yeah.
So while I do the debunk side, and I can't help but fall in love with the historical, with the literature, with the genre, with how this is quite intelligent in many ways. Because you realize that the fundamentalists are actually wrong on how they're assessing the information. It makes it even more fun. So that's my take.
Yeah. Well, that's maybe a good place to leave it here. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming. We've got Lord Sobek. We Are Being Transformed. Go subscribe. Gnostic Informant, Neal. I'm sure you're already subscribed, and with Derek, you have to be 100% subscribed to MythVision. So
we do cast people in the outer darkness who aren't, just in case you're wondering. I mean, it's
you will go to hell for eternity if you don't subscribe to MythVision.
This is true.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Actually, Elliot, can I add just one thing really quickly?
Yeah.
I just thought of something really quickly. I think if you look at what Neal, Derek, and I are doing, we have a game engine, right? Going back to that analogy, but we're all approaching it from completely different aspects, and maybe we have our own little synoptic problem going on here. But yeah, I mean, if you want to come just learn about nerdy stuff, come to my channel. Religion's my third love. Sorry, I can't compete with building Lego with a 4-year-old. That's my hot trip to heaven. So that'll always be my first love. But religion and music next. So just come by, nerd out with us.
Yeah, good deal. So it's like 4 different YouTube channels, 4 gospels, right? So which one is which? Yeah. Derek is Mark because he came first, but
I have the sloppiest narrative, but you'd be shocked by the ending. I can tell you that much.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching, and have an awesome day.